January 17th, 1945. A freezing morning in the Rhineland. The frost clings to the shattered windows of a requisitioned textile factory near Aryan, where the air smells of damp wool and disinfectant. 37 women stand in a line, their breath visible in the cold. They wear the remnants of Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms, gray tunics with missing buttons, mud-caked boots, threadbare stockings. Their hair, meticulously braided or pinned according to regulations drilled into them since girlhood, catches the pale winter light filtering through the broken roof. Outside, American jeeps idle in the courtyard. Inside, a German-speaking WWAC lieutenant holds a pair of scissors, her expression unreadable. The women do not speak. They have been taught not to speak unless spoken to, but their eyes wide, defiant, terrified, speak volumes. This is not combat. This is not interrogation. This is something else entirely. Something that cuts deeper than shrapnel. The women are Nachrichtenhelferinnen, communications auxiliaries. Blitzmodell, the propaganda called them. Lightning girls. They were the daughters, sisters, and wives who volunteered or were conscripted into the war machine's nervous system, operating switchboards, decoding transmissions, plotting coordinates. They were told they were serving the fatherland with honor, that their service was as vital as any soldier's, that they were the new women of the Reich, strong, disciplined, ideologically pure. They were never supposed to become prisoners. The Reich's doctrine held that German women, embodiments of Aryan motherhood and racial superiority, would never fall into enemy hands because the Wehrmacht would never retreat far enough for that to happen. But here they are. The Reich's promises have dissolved like morning fog, and now they stand in a commandeered factory that once produced uniforms for the very army that abandoned them. The order comes not from cruelty but from policy. Though the women cannot distinguish between the two in this moment, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, in its infinite bureaucratic wisdom, has mandated that all prisoners of war, regardless of gender, must undergo delousing procedures and have their hair cut short to prevent the spread of typhus and lice scourges that have turned German prison camps and refugee columns into epidemiological nightmares. The directive is medical, practical, rooted in the grim lessons learned from Napoleon's campaigns and the trenches of the Great War. But medicine and symbolism are not easily separated, especially when the patient is a woman whose entire identity has been constructed around notions of purity, discipline, and appearance. In the Reich, a woman's hair was never just hair. It was a political statement, a racial marker, a certificate of genetic worthiness. The regime's propaganda machinery had spent 12 years equating long, blonde, braided hair with Aryan virtue. Photographs of mothers with carefully coiffed hair nursing infants were plastered on posters celebrating the Mutterkreuz, the Mother's Cross, awarded to women who bore 4 or more children for the Führer. Leni Riefenstahl's cameras lovingly captured the flowing hair of maidens dancing at harvest festivals. Their movements choreographed to suggest an eternal, pastoral Germany, untouched by modernity or defeat. The Bund Deutscher Modell, the League of German Girls, enforced strict grooming standards. Hair must be clean, neat, braided, or pinned, never dyed, never cut short in the decadent fashion of American or British women. Short hair was degenerate. Short hair was Bolshevik. Short hair was Jewish. Short hair was everything the New Order opposed. The women had internalized these messages completely. Many had joined the auxiliaries voluntarily, motivated by genuine belief in the cause or simply by the promise of wages and status in a society where women's opportunities were otherwise rigidly circumscribed. They had marched in formation, sung the Horst Wessel lied with fervor, attended indoctrination sessions where they learned that German women were the biological foundation of the thousand-year Reich. Their bodies, their fertility, their very hair follicles were political assets, and now in this freezing factory, they're about to lose one of the most visible symbols of that identity. The first woman steps forward. She is perhaps 23, with straw-colored hair wound into her crown braid Gretchen style, favored by the regime for its folk authenticity. Her hands tremble as she removes the pins. The braid uncoils, falling past her shoulders. The WAC lieutenant gestures to a wooden stool. The woman sits. The scissors open and close with a metallic whisper. Blonde strands fall to the concrete floor like severed threads of ideology. The cut is not brutal. The American medic performing it has been instructed to leave enough hair for basic dignity, but it is irrevocable. When the woman stands and catches her reflection in a shard of mirror propped against the wall, she does not recognize herself. Her neck feels exposed, vulnerable, obscene. She touches the shorn ends with shaking fingers, and something inside her cracks. What the women expected and what they experienced formed a chasm too wide to bridge with reason. They had been told that if the impossible happened and they were captured, the enemy would be inhuman. Propaganda films and newsreels had painted the Americans as gangster capitalists who would enslave or murder German women without hesitation. The Soviets, of course, were portrayed as subhuman rapists, but even the Western allies were depicted as morally corrupt. Their societies so decadent that German women prisoners could expect nothing but degradation. The reality they encountered was infinitely more confusing. The American guards were not savages. They offered cigarettes, coffee, and chocolate luxuries. The women had not tasted in months. They handled them with an impersonal efficiency that was neither cruel nor kind, merely administrative. And that, paradoxically, made the haircut worse. There was no malice to rail against, no villain to hate, just a procedure. Just policy. Just the quiet, bureaucratic erasure of an identity. Historical records from the International Red Cross and U.S. Army Medical Corps documents reveal that between January and May 1945, thousands of female auxiliaries and Wehrmacht support personnel were processed through Allied detention centers in the Rhineland and Bavaria. The delousing and hair-cutting protocols were standard for all POWs, male and female, German and otherwise. Typhus was a genuine threat. Outbreaks had already devastated concentration camp survivors and displaced persons. The medical justification was sound, but the psychological impact on the women was profound and poorly documented, largely because military psychiatrists of the era paid little attention to the emotional states of enemy female prisoners. They were a logistical footnote, not a priority. Yet scattered testimonies exist, interviews conducted decades later by German oral historians, memoirs published in obscure regional presses, letters discovered in family archives. These fragments paint a consistent picture. The women described the haircutting not as a medical procedure, but as a violation, a Enterung, a dishonoring. One former Nachrichtenhelferin, interviewed in 1978, recalled, "When they cut my hair, I felt as if they had cut away my Germanness." I know that sounds absurd. It was just hair, but it was not just hair. It was everything we had been told we were. Another, writing in an unpublished memoir held by the German Federal Archives, described the moment as the second death. The first was when we realized the Reich had lost. The second was when we realized we were no longer who we had been. The psychological mechanism at work was identity foreclosure, the sudden, traumatic collapse of a carefully constructed self-concept. These women had been indoctrinated since adolescence into a rigid worldview that assigned profound meaning to superficial markers. When those markers were removed, even for rational reasons, the scaffolding of their identity collapsed. They were forced to confront a disorienting question. If they were no longer recognizable as the women the Reich had made them, who were they? The Americans, for their part, were largely oblivious to this internal crisis. To the GIs guarding the detention centers, the female POWs were a novelty, an administrative headache, occasionally a source of pity or uncomfortable attraction. The women were fed better than they had eaten in months: rations, powdered eggs, canned meat, and provided with medical care that far exceeded what the Wehrmacht had offered its own auxiliaries in the war's final months. From the American perspective, they were being treated humanely, even generously. The haircutting was a minor inconvenience, a hygienic necessity. The fact that it shattered the women's sense of self did not register. This disconnect illuminates a broader truth about the nature of ideological collapse. The women had been raised in a totalitarian system that weaponized aesthetics, that turned grooming and fashion into instruments of political control. They had been taught that their value derived not from individual autonomy but from their conformity to racial and gender ideals. When the Americans casually severed the most visible symbol of that conformity, they were not trying to humiliate. They were simply indifferent to the symbol's meaning, and that indifference was its own form of devastation. It revealed that the entire apparatus of meaning the Reich had constructed was hollow, recognized by no one outside its collapsing borders. The symbolic weight of hair in wartime is not unique to Nazi Germany. but the regime exploited it with particular intensity. Hair has always been entangled with gender, sexuality, power, and purity. In ancient Rome, a woman's unbound hair signaled mourning or madness. In medieval Europe, nuns shaved their heads to renounce worldly vanity. In revolutionary France, women who fraternized with the enemy had their heads shaved as public punishment. The Nazis understood this symbolic vocabulary and weaponized it. They photographed concentration camp inmates with shaved heads to dehumanize them, to strip them of individuality. They celebrated German women's long hair as proof of racial vitality. The regime created a binary: shorn heads meant subhuman, full heads meant Aryan. And now, in 1940-45, that binary was collapsing in the most ironic way imaginable. German women, the supposed pinnacles of racial purity, were being shorn by their conquerors, and the Reich was too shattered to avenge or even acknowledge the indignity. As the weeks passed in the detention centers, the women began to adapt. Hair grows back, after all, though identity does not regenerate so easily. Some women embrace the short hair as a liberation, a shedding of the regime's suffocating expectations. They had spent years performing a version of femininity dictated by men who viewed them as broodmares and switchboard operators. Now, with their hair short and the war lost, they could begin to imagine a different self. Others remained haunted, unable to reconcile their shorn appearance with the women they believed themselves to be. They fashioned makeshift headscarves from rags, refused to look at mirrors, wrote bitter letters home describing their humiliation in language borrowed directly from Nazi propaganda letters that military censors read with bemusement or indifference before filing them away. The Americans, meanwhile, were grappling with their own confusions about the female POWs. The GIs had been trained to view German soldiers as fanatical enemies, but the presence of women in uniform complicated that narrative. Were these women victims or perpetrators? Innocent civilians coerced into service, or true believers who had enabled the regime's crimes? The answer, of course, was both and neither. They were individuals with complex motivations, but the Allied command structure had no framework for processing that complexity. So they were treated as generic POWs, subjected to the same protocols as male prisoners, their specific experiences and traumas rendered invisible by bureaucratic uniformity. One recurring detail in the testimonies is the presence of mirrors. The detention centers had few mirrors. Most had been broken during combat or looting, but the women sought them out obsessively. They needed to see what had been done to them, to confront the stranger staring back. Some wept, some laughed bitterly. A few, according to one American nurse's diary entry from March 1945, simply stared at their reflections in silence for minutes at a time, as if waiting for the image to make sense. The mirror became a symbol of rupture, a glass barrier between the self they remembered and the self they had become. The haircut also functioned as a social leveler within the prisoner population. In the Wehrmacht Auxiliary Corps, rank and status had been meticulously maintained through uniforms, insignia, and grooming standards. Officers wore their hair in neat chignons, enlisted women in practical braids. But after the mandatory cuts, distinctions blurred. A former Oberhelfer and senior auxiliary with close-cropped hair looked much like a raw recruit. The hierarchy that had structured their entire military existence dissolved, leaving them equal in their shared humiliation. This erasure of rank further destabilized their identities. If they were no longer officers or soldiers, if they were no longer recognizable as the women the Reich had forged, what were they? The answer came slowly, painfully through the mundane routines of captivity. They learned that the Americans would not execute them, would not starve them, would not rape them as a matter of policy, though individual incidents of abuse did occur, as they do in every army, every war. They learned that their captors were strangely obsessed with paperwork, with documenting every prisoner's name, rank, and unit affiliation with a meticulousness that rivaled the Reich's own bureaucracy. They learned that American women, the WACs, and nurses treated them with a brisk professional sympathy that was neither warm nor cold, just efficient. And they learned, most confusingly of all, that the Americans seemed to regard the war as a job that was nearly finished, not as a crusade or a struggle for racial survival. The ideological fervor that had defined the German war effort was absent. The Americans chewed gum, read comic books, complained about the food, and counted the days until they could go home. They were not supermen or devils. They were just tired young men in uniform, and that ordinariness was perhaps the most subversive revelation of all. One woman, a former radio operator named Margaret, later wrote in a letter to her sister, They gave us soap, real soap, not the ersatz filth we had been using. And chocolate. Can you imagine? Chocolate while Germany starves. I ate it and felt ashamed, but I ate it. They cut our hair and fed us chocolate. What kind of enemy does that? The juxtaposition, humiliation and abundance, defeat and comfort created a cognitive dissonance that no amount of indoctrination had prepared them for. The Reich had taught them that suffering and sacrifice were virtues. The material comfort was decadent and corrupting, but here was the enemy, supposedly decadent and weak, offering them a standard of living higher than what the Wehrmacht had provided. The logic did not hold. The narrative collapsed. The symbolic object that recurs throughout the scattered testimonies is not the scissors, though they were the instrument of transformation, but the mirror. Broken mirrors, polished metal plates, shards of glass. Anything that could reflect an image became charged with meaning. The women returned to mirrors again and again, compulsively checking whether their hair had grown, whether they looked more like themselves, whether the stranger in the reflection might one day reconcile with the person they remembered being. The mirror symbolized the fractured self, the unbridgeable gap between past and present, between the woman the Reich had created and the woman who now existed in its ruins. By spring, as Germany's final collapse accelerated and the full scope of the Holocaust became undeniable, the women's concerns about their hair seemed almost absurd, even to themselves. Newsreels showed the liberation of Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald, prisoners who were skeletal, whose hair had been shaved for dehumanization and delousing, who had suffered atrocities that made a mandatory haircut seem trivial. Some of the female POWs confronted with this evidence experienced a second psychological fracture. They had known, vaguely, that camps existed, that Jews and political prisoners were being detained, but the scale and systematic cruelty had been hidden or dismissed as enemy propaganda. Now it was undeniable, and the realization that they had served, however peripherally, a regime capable of such evil forced them to reevaluate everything, including their own suffering. Some women responded with denial. The camp footage was fake, Allied propaganda designed to justify the war and the occupation. Others fell into a defensive silence, refusing to discuss the war at all. A few, a very few, experienced what psychologists would later term moral injury, a profound recognition of complicity and guilt. One woman interviewed in the 1980s recalled, "I cried when they cut my hair. I thought it was the worst thing that could happen to me. Then I saw the photographs from Dachau, women with shaved heads who had been starved and gassed. And I realized my tears had been for nothing. I had been crying over vanity while people were being murdered. I felt so ashamed. I still do." This layering of trauma, personal humiliation, ideological collapse, and moral reckoning created psychological scars that many women carried for the rest of their lives. Post-war Germany had little interest in their stories. The narrative of German suffering focused on the bombings, the expulsions from the East, the deprivations of the Stunde Null Zero Hour. Female POWs occupied an uncomfortable space in that narrative. They were neither innocent civilian victims nor heroic resistors. They had served the regime, but not in combat roles that could be romanticized or martyred. Their stories were awkward, unglamorous, and so they were largely forgotten. The Americans, having processed and released the women by late 1945, moved on. The female POWs were a minor footnote in official histories, a few paragraphs in after-action reports, a handful of photographs in archives. The scissors were cleaned and returned to medical supplies. The mirrors were swept up with the other debris of occupation. The women dispersed into the chaos of post-war Germany, their hair slowly growing back, their sense of self slowly, painfully reconstructing itself in a nation that was also trying to figure out who. It was now that the Reich was gone, but the cut remained. Not just the physical act, but the symbolic violence of it, the forced confrontation with a self stripped of its ideological costume. The women had believed they were essential to the Reich, that their service mattered, that their sacrifices had meaning. The haircut, in its mundane necessity, revealed a harsher truth. They were not special, not racially superior, not chosen. They were just people, vulnerable and powerless, caught in the machinery of a collapsing totalitarian state. And when that machinery broke down, no one, not the Führer, not the Wehrmacht, Not the ideology they had internalized could protect them from the ordinary indignities of defeat. In the years that followed, West Germany rebuilt itself on a foundation of Wirtschafts under the economic miracle and collective amnesia. The war was framed as a tragedy that had happened to Germany, not a crime Germany had committed. The women who had served in the auxiliaries became housewives, secretaries, teachers. They married, raised children, and rarely spoke of the war. When they did, the stories they told were carefully edited, emphasizing hardship and loss while omitting complicity and belief. The haircut, when mentioned at all, was described as a humiliation inflicted by the victors, a petty cruelty designed to break German pride. The medical rationale was forgotten or dismissed. The broader context, the typhus epidemics, the millions of displaced persons, the logistical nightmare of managing a defeated nation was erased. Only the emotional truth remained. They had been made to feel ashamed, and that shame had never fully healed. But shame is a complex emotion, and its sources are not always what they seem. The women were not ashamed of losing their hair. They were ashamed of realizing that the identity the hair represented was hollow. They were ashamed of how easily they had internalized the regime's lies, how completely they had surrendered their individuality to a collective fantasy of racial greatness. They were ashamed of the relief they felt when the Americans fed them chocolate and treated them with bureaucratic indifference rather than the savage cruelty they had been promised. They were ashamed, above all, of how quickly they adapted, how readily they accepted the new reality, how little loyalty they ultimately felt to the ideology that had demanded their absolute devotion. The haircut was just a catalyst, a moment when all those submerged doubts and contradictions were forced to the surface. The act of cutting hair, in this context, became a ritual of transformation, not the transformation the women underwent willingly, but the one imposed upon them by history. It stripped away the veneer of ideology and revealed the vulnerable human beneath. It forced them to confront the fact that their entire worldview had been constructed on lies, and that those lies had been maintained through aesthetics, performance, and coercion. And it demonstrated with brutal simplicity that the Reich's promises were empty. There would be no 1,000-year Reich. There would be no final victory. There would only be defeat, occupation, and the long, difficult work of rebuilding a self from the ruins of a discredited ideology. The Americans who wielded the scissors had no idea they were performing this function. They were just following orders, trying to prevent disease, ticking boxes on a checklist. They were not trying to humiliate or enlighten. They were simply indifferent to the symbolic weight their actions carried. And that indifference was, in its way, the most devastating lesson the women learned. The world did not care about their ideology, their sacrifices, their carefully maintained hair. The world had moved on. The Reich was rubble and ashes, and they were just prisoners who needed the lousing. In the decades after the war, a few historians and psychologists began to examine the experiences of female POWs with more nuance and empathy. They noted that the women's trauma was real, even if its sources were entangled with a criminal ideology. They documented the ways in which totalitarian regimes exploit gender norms and aesthetics to enforce conformity and loyalty. They recognized that the women were both victims and participants, that these categories were not mutually exclusive, but the scholarship remained marginal, overshadowed by the greater atrocities of the Holocaust and the broader narrative of German victimhood. The women's stories remained fragmented, scattered across archives and family memories, never coalescing into a coherent counter-narrative. Perhaps that is as it should be. The story of the haircut is not a story of heroism or resistance. It is not even, properly speaking, a story of victimization. Though the women experienced it as such, it is a story about the fragility of identity when that identity is constructed on the scaffolding of ideology. It is a story about what happens when the external markers we use to define ourselves, uniforms, hairstyles, rituals, beliefs, are suddenly stripped away, and we are forced to confront the question, who am I without these things?
It is a story, ultimately, about the ordinary violence of history, the way grand ideologies and geopolitical forces manifest in the mundane, intimate details of individual lives, a pair of scissors, a shorn head, a face in a broken mirror.
And it is a story about abundance and scarcity, not just material but symbolic. The Americans had an abundance of everything: food, equipment, confidence, futures. The German women had nothing but the remnants of a failed ideology and the shorn hair that symbolized its collapse. The Americans could afford to be indifferent, to treat the haircut as a routine medical procedure, because they were not invested in the symbolic order it represented. The women could not afford indifference. The haircut meant everything to them because they had been taught that everything meant something, that every detail of appearance and behavior was a political statement, a racial marker, a measure of worth. The regime had colonized their identities so completely that even their hair was not their own. And when the Americans cut it, they were not just preventing typhus. They were severing the last threads connecting the women to a world that no longer existed. The epilogue to this story is not redemptive. Most of the women lived long lives, integrated into post-war society, and died without ever fully reconciling the contradictions of their youth. Some became committed Democrats, repudiating the ideology they had once served. Others remained nostalgic for the Reich, though they learned to keep such sentiments private. A few became feminists, recognizing in hindsight how thoroughly the regime had instrumentalized and constrained them. But all carried the memory of that January morning. The cold factory, the scissors, the falling hair, the stranger in the mirror. It was a moment of rupture, a before and after, a cut that never fully healed. What does this story teach us about freedom, about ideology, about the self? It teaches us that identity is more fragile than we imagine, that the markers we use to define ourselves are arbitrary and contingent, that the ideologies we internalize can collapse with shocking suddenness. It teaches us that abundance, material, symbolic, ideological, can be a weapon as devastating as any bomb, because it reveals the poverty of competing worldviews with pitiless clarity. It teaches us that humiliation is not always intentional, that sometimes the cruelest blows are struck by those who do not even realize they are striking. And it teaches us that history is not made of grand narratives and heroic struggles alone, but also of small, intimate violences, a haircut, a mirror, a moment of recognition that everything you believed was a lie. The women who stood in that factory in January 1945 were not monsters. They were not heroes. They were just people who had been shaped by a monstrous ideology, who had believed what they were told to believe, who had performed the roles assigned to them with competence and conviction. And when that ideology collapsed, when the roles were stripped away, when the hair fell to the floor, they were forced to discover who they actually were beneath the performance. Some never managed it. Some spent the rest of their lives trying. The cut remains not just in their memories, but in the historical record, a small, sharp reminder that the fall of empires is measured not just in battles and treaties, but in broken mirrors and shorn heads and the terrible, liberating question, who am I now?